This year marks 50 years of Specialized as a bicycle company and 43 years of the Stumpjumper. This behind me is the newest iteration of that platform, and over the past few years we've seen the Stumpjumper kind of evolve and take shape with the straight Stumpjumper range, the Evo, but all of those are now condensing into one model yet again, the Stumpjumper 15. The 15th iteration of the Stumpjumper that you see here sports a little bit over 140 millimeters of rear wheel travel paired to a 150 millimeter fork. Now some of the builds do come with a 160 fork, but for the most part it's 142, 150. Now for this 15th iteration of the Stumpjumper, Specialized really seemed to want to get outside of the mold a little bit. Their mantra that they always refer back to is innovate or die. And they do really apply that. You can see internally they're always trying unusual things, but what they've resulted with is a pretty normal looking bike. It's FSR suspension, the same that they've been using for a long time. It's got very, very similar geometry to the outgoing Stumpjumper, but there are still some little things inside this bike that set it apart, that make it unique, and that are genuine firsts in the industry. Before we get into those special little details that make this bike unique, I think we should touch on the geometry overall. Now, like the outgoing Stumpjumper Evo, this bike has adjustable everything. It has the same headset that the Evo had, so you can change the stock head tube angle by a degree plus or minus, depending on your preference. It has the high-low flip chip that changes the bottom bracket height by 7 millimeters and also slackens the head and seat tube angle by half a degree when you do that. Additionally, you can change the rear wheel size by swapping out this main link if you want to go to a 27.5 rear wheel or a 29er. An important caveat is the S1 and S2 sizes can only be run as a mixed wheel bike. They're doing that for a variety of reasons. The team at Specialized found that they were selling a ton of links to convert those full 29 S1 and S2 bikes into mullets, kind of indicating that most riders wanted a smaller rear wheel. And then in doing a bunch of ride testing with smaller riders, found that the clearance for the butt and the general fit of the bike was improved when they spec'd a smaller rear wheel. Lastly, with those smaller bikes, they could get a longer dropper insertion for them, meaning that you're not just constrained to like 120, 150 mil post. If you're a smaller rider, you can actually start pushing the dropper length because you're not running into compromises made to accommodate wheel size. That said, for S3, S4, S5, S6, you do have the option between 27.5 rear wheel and a 29 rear wheel. Now, geometry on this bike can get a little complex when you start to play with all the different adjustments that one could make. So I'm going to talk about things as they come stock, which is in the neutral head tube angle and the high bottom bracket setting. The head tube on this bike, head tube angle, is 64.5 degrees, which is a pretty perfect neutral for I think most trail riding. It's slack enough for steeps, but still corners very nicely. Doesn't make the bike feel too lazy. The seat tube angle on all sizes is right around 77 degrees with like tenths of a degree of variation around there. The reach numbers vary from 400 millimeters on the S1 all the way up to 530 millimeters on the S6. I'm riding an S5 and that strikes a 500 mil reach number. The chainstays vary per size with some paired sizes in there. S1, S2 are like 430, 432, and then S3 and 4 share a 435 mil chainstay, with the biggest two sizes, S5 and S6, sharing a 445 mil chainstay. So, the new Stumpjumper also features the brand new SWAT 4.0 system. Now, Epic kind of stole the thunder on this a little bit, but what this is a brand new door and mechanism that makes the whole operation easier, more waterproof, and more durable. Now, as I touched on at the top of the video, Specialized is consolidating the Stumpjumper lineup to no longer contain two bikes, but one. This is just the Stumpjumper now. There's no Evo, there's no non-Evo, it's just Stumpjumper. This bike is meant to strike a pretty clean balance between the outgoing Stumpy and the outgoing Evo, while also increasing the capability of the platform overall. That seems like maybe kind of a conflicting goal, but they've done it via some interesting novel shock technologies that I'll touch on in a little bit. Suffice to say, It's definitely biasing more towards the Evo end of the spectrum in terms of what the bike is meant to do and how it feels. I think part of the logic there is the new Specialized Epic, their 120mm XC bike, starts to kind of eat some of the outgoing Stumpjumper's lunch when it comes to being this like capable but efficient feeling trail bike. So I think perhaps their thought is, if you're someone who thinks they want this like light, snappy, very quick pedalable bike, maybe the Epic is the better choice than a Stumpjumper. And so I think that's kind of where the lineup is heading, is the Epic gets beefed up a little bit, is slightly more capable. The new Stumpjumper biases more towards the Evo, but can be altered to kind of feel a variety of different ways. Now, what I have in front of me here is the Specialized Genie. I'm gonna avoid any bottle puns, any wishes granted. It's the name they've given this cool new shock, and I think it's a good name. The magic carpet pun applies. The idea behind the Genie is as much air volume as possible and tuning the kinematic of the bike to suit that. What they've done here is they've taken a Fox float shock and built upon it a very large air can that allows them to essentially make as linear a spring as possible out of this shape. The crude analogy I've been using to describe it is, think of, you have a basketball and a beach ball pumped up both to 30 PSI. You press on that basketball, it's gonna ramp up and feel firm a lot sooner than a beach ball, where you're gonna plunge your hand into it and get quite a bit of travel out of that before it starts to feel firm. This is the beach ball, where the stock version of this shock is the basketball. There are good graphics that we'll have overlaid here to describe the inner workings, but essentially what's happening is, as you drive the shock for the first 70% of travel, you have a massive air volume. That means the spring is relatively linear and you're packing air slower than you would be if it were a smaller air volume. At that 70% mark, there's a puck inside here that closes off this extra air chamber and turns the very large air volume into a very small air volume. That means the shock then ramps up quite quickly and keeps you from bottoming out. It sounds a little complicated, but basically what they're doing is making a two-stage air spring. More typically, we have one air volume that is fixed and compresses at whatever rate the linkage is designed to compress it at. This is two air chambers that are position dependent and allow them to have a very, very linear beginning of stroke and mid-stroke with a very progressive end stroke. Now, for people who maybe don't want that super linear feel and want a more progressive bike, you can fill the extra volume chamber with these special tokens. All you have to do is take this little clip off, slide that off, and clip between 0 and 4 of these puppies on. And it drastically changes the character of the bike. They come stock with one spacer installed, so it's a fairly linear feel with a bit more ramp up. If you gut it and run it totally open, it feels super plush, very gushy, I think was the term I ended up describing it with. If you stuff it full of these, it feels quite progressive and maybe along the lines of a traditional 130 mil, 140 mil trail bike. It's really, really worth playing with these volume spacers. I think generally people don't play with volume spacers all that much on their suspension because it's a little bit of a thing to do, but Specialized has done a lot to make this as easy a process as possible. I've done it trailside quite a bit. Again, all you do, unthread this, take the air out, circlip off, slide that puppy down, and you can play with these spacers to your heart's content. There are also two different sizes of bottom out spacers that you can change in the shock. Those do require a bit more work to get to. You have to use a strap wrench to undo it like you would a traditional shock, but those change the last 30% ramp up. So say you want a more linear bottom out or a more progressive bottom out, you can change the volume spacer there to affect that feeling. Now, there is plenty of, let's say, healthy skepticism around the idea of proprietary components on bikes. Luckily, I don't think this is like some dangerous move on Specialized's part. It's just a better shock for this bike. It's not the only shock for this bike. You could run any stock offering that's tuned for this kinematic as long as it fits the same eye to eye and stroke. But the Genie shock really does optimize what this bike is meant for. In order to arrive at this as a final setup for the bike, Specialized played with a ton of different prototype shocks that are all playing with air volume, with oil volume. They tried a piggyback version of this and ended up just deciding that this was the best thing for the job. I think it's a pretty simple reasoning. They thought it optimized performance without adding too much weight and while remaining fairly simple for the end user. I'll have more on that development side in the article on the front page, so do head over there to check all that info out. But suffice to say, it's not something crazy, way out of left field. It's just a better shock for this bike. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, Dario, what is the percent difference in bump absorption on the new Stumpjumper versus the old Stumpjumper Evo? Well, you're in luck because I have that data. It's 16.3% better at bump absorption than the old Evo, which is pretty impressive because it's shorter travel. Wow, there is a tremendously crushed slug right in front of me. That might be a frog, I don't know. Because of the Genie shock, because of the very linear kinematic of this bike, the rear wheel moves more over every bump. That may seem in a way as like a more inefficient use of travel, but it's not. It just means that it's cycling more. It's a sensation that's difficult to describe, but you can kind of start to feel it on trail, where you run through a chattery section and it feels less like the wheel's knocking into things and more like it's humming over them. What's surprising and impressive is that in, let's say, like an optimal area of travel, kind of like right in the mid-stroke per sag measurement, this bike is very, very close to the Enduro's kinematic for that block of travel. So this bike is a little more supportive than the Enduro off the top, but is so linear that it matches the Enduro in that middle section and then kind of remains more linear through the end of travel because of that special Genie shock technology. All to say, it does really well over bumps. Some quick notes on pricing before we get into ride impressions and who I think this bike might be for. This bike is not cheap. Boy, oh boy. Starting price for a complete build is the Expert at $6,500 US. This is a carbon only bike currently. I hope to see an aluminum one come soon, but for the time being, it's just a carbon frame, nice parts hung from it. We don't have final information on build kits, but this will be in the article when this bike goes live. Please refer to that. But starting price for a complete bike, $6,500. The Pro model that I've been riding here retails for $9,000 US, and the S-Works bike retails for $12,000 US. The S-Works bike for the new Stumpjumper is not a different frame layup. It's the same 11M carbon frame as this bike and the others. So no lighter frame benefit. It's just the nicest parts kit and it costs a lot. You can get the S-Works frame only for $3,500. As kind of a black sheep build in the lineup, there's the Öhlins coil that comes with a 160 mil Öhlins fork, an Öhlins TTX 22M coil shock, some TRP brakes, just generally a slightly beefier build kit. It's a bit odd to me that it doesn't come with the shock that this bike was ostensibly built around, but I think for some people it's going to be an appealing option. And the retail on that Öhlins coil build is $8,500. Now, something that might be divisive to say the least is the omission of any mechanical drivetrain routing on this bike. Meaning this is the first mass production mountain bike that is electronic drivetrain only. There are only 2 ports in the head tube, dropper and rear brake, and there is no cable routing in the drive side chainstay. So for the time being, this is a transmission or axis only bike. You know, we'll see, I'm sure there are more electronic drivetrains coming, and to Specialized's point, they think that electronic drivetrains are the finest shifting available currently. That said, I can't help but think that there will be some people who are a bit upset about the omission of a mechanical option. Again, I understand their point. It's a very high-end system. It's a very high-end bike. The two make sense together. Yeah, I'm curious to see what people think about this. I'm sure there will be some upset people in the comments, but you know, genuinely, I'm curious if this is like a deal breaker for people or if it's a deal maker. It's definitely a first, so someone had to do it. This is not a full-fledged review, though I've had a ton of time on this bike. I'm just gonna give a few brief thoughts on what I've thought of the Stumpy platform so far. It's great. The climbing characteristic feels neutral. It's not super sporty. It has good traction, gets through technical stuff really nicely. Just feels like a bike meant to ride all over the place, not necessarily like competing with your XC bike. Descending is super impressive. The rear end of this bike is capable beyond the travel numbers in a way that we always say like, oh, it feels like a bigger bike. It really feels like a bigger bike. The fact that the rear wheel can just move so much through choppy terrain and over obstacles, and even just preloading the bike, makes it capable of achieving grip and composure through rough stuff that you don't usually get out of a trail bike. In that sense, I think it's really unique. It can feel at times like the back end is outrunning the front, so I'd play potentially with a 160 mil fork for some people, for some places. But overall, really well balanced. It has all the geo adjustments that we loved about the outgoing frame. They're just as well integrated here, and the frame overall has just a really nice fit and finish. I think, you know, the price is high, but the quality of the bike warrants that, and the fact that it is this unique singular offering kind of does as well. Clearly, I have a lot of thoughts about this bike. I think the fact that it could be so many different things makes it a little difficult to shoehorn, but in a way that indicates its biggest strong suit, which is that it's just a really good one bike. It does a lot of things well. It can be many different things, just depending on what you want out of it. Stay tuned for a long-term review where I touch on all the different things this bike could be. Subscribe to the channel to check that out when it drops. And in the meantime, head over to the Pinkbike homepage. Please check out the article I've put up on this bike. There's a lot of interesting development that went into the new shock, into the frame. And I think it kind of sheds some light on why Specialized made the decisions they did in landing here. But for now, go out, have a fun ride, and a good day. Peace. I mean, it could be a slug or a frog. If you told me it was a mouse, I would believe you. Oh, God.